Professor Mark Solms, Professor Karl Friston, thank you so much for joining me one more time on the show. You have both been part of the show for so many years now, and it's a privilege and honor for me to host the both of you on this show together. So thank you so much for joining me. What I figured we'd do is my role will be very minimal. I'll try to give prompts when needed, if needed. But for the most part, I think most of the people tune in to listen and watch you guys. And the topic today is something we're all thinking about, we're all talking about it. Is it possible to engineer artificial consciousness? I think it's a fitting topic for the two of you, both pioneers in this field. And I think to start this off, we should begin with some foundational definitions. How do you, perhaps Karl, you could begin, how do you define intelligence and how do you define consciousness?
Right. Well, I'll start off with the easly ones, then Mark can take the difficult ones. So, I'm being ironic. Intelligence, or certainly natural intelligence, is in my world just inference. It's just sense making within an inactive aspect. So there's also decision making that's predicated on that sense making, and therefore can be described in terms of inference or self-evidencing, as Jacob Hauer would like to say. It's from the physicist's perspective, this is a particular kind of self-organization or a particular reading of self-organization under a particular partition into self and non-self, or something and something else, that can be mathematically described as the Bayesian mechanics. And that Bayesian mechanics, I repeat, can be interpreted in terms of inferring the causes of your sensations and deciding what to do in order to solicit the right kind of sensations, to engineer or author your own sensorium in order to make the best sense of it, in order to make the best decisions. So there's an inherent circuit causality in this self-organization. If you survive, and you survive as an agent, and for me, an agent would be a system that can be read as possessing or acting as if it had a world or a generative model of the consequences of its own actions. So it has a model of its own private future, and it has to select particular paths into the future. So it's a future pointing kind of inference that is private to the individual, the agent, or the intelligent artifact in question. Consciousness, you should be asking Mark this. Consciousness, I think, is something else, especially if you're talking about phenomenology or feelings. And one would have to identify the particular attributes of the generative models in play that must have this future pointing agentic aspect in order to qualify or support either consciousness in a vague sense that it could be different levels of consciousness, or if you want to draw a bright line between things that are self-aware or indeed are just aware in a phenomenal sense, you'd have to identify what parts of their world model equip them with the capacity to feel and to experience. And then I'll hand over to Mark for what that particular architectural feature would be.
Thanks, Tevin. Thanks, Karl. Let me start by commenting on your introductory remark, Tevin, that you're probably going to say very little because people are interested in what Karl and I have to say. I tell you what worries me is that, and this is going to be interesting from my point of view if I'm wrong, but what worries me is that Karl and I are going to agree on everything. And so it therefore won't be very interesting to hear us echoing each other. But maybe we won't. And so let's see what happens. But that's what I anticipate. And to illustrate the point, everything that Karl just said, I agree with. But I will try to, unlike Karl, us South Africans will speak English instead of active inferees, and also I'll try and keep it simple. To me, I mean, although I really do agree with everything that Karl said, I don't think in such a complex technical way as he does. So for me, intelligence, which comes by degrees, is capacity to solve problems. And of course, I understand why you're asking us these questions. It's because you're setting up the difference between artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. So intelligence is the capacity to solve problems. And those problems can be as narrow as how to play chess. Or it could be something much more general. And that's where things get interesting. And this is why I say intelligence it comes in degrees. The current artificial intelligences don't have that much intelligence because they can only do very narrow things. Now, consciousness, I define that as the capacity to feel like something. In other words, I follow Nagel's definition. A system is conscious if and only if there's something it is like to be such a system, something it is like for such a system. And that's a very elementary definition in both senses of the word. Elementary in that it's simple, and elementary in that it's talking about the most simple form of consciousness. I mean, you don't need our human type of consciousness to meet that definition. You just have to be able to feel like something. There's some quality, some phenomenal experiential property to being a thing that is conscious. It doesn't have to be able to reflect upon it. It doesn't even have to know that it is a thing in the sense of having any consciousness of that, of its own being. It just has to feel like something to be it. But I hasten to add, because this is what leads to so much confusion, that of course there are layers upon layers of complexity that can be superadded to feeling. And then you get things like human consciousness, which unfortunately too many people, even people in our field, take as their kind of model example. It's what they have in mind when they use the word. And I think that this is unfortunate.
Mark, but I completely agree. And I think that's part of the reason why I wanted you guys to chat is because the listeners are quite familiar with the story, but when I wrote my dissertation, you and Karl were cited many times and oftentimes together in the same paper. So it makes a lot of sense that you guys would think alike, but I think it's still going to be valuable. And I think people are going to take a lot away from this. With that being said, Karl, you have the free energy principle, which describes adaptive systems and minimizing surprise. And then Mark, you place affect or feeling at the very core of conscious experience. If we were to design a system that does both, let's say minimizes free energy and generates affective states, would that system be conscious, or would this be mere mimicry?
Or would this be a what?
Mimicry, so something that mimics consciousness.
So who are you asking that question?
Karl, would you like to start?
Oh, right. Yes. So I think before trying to give you an answer to that question, I think it's important to state before we go any further that consciousness, however read, is not something that you can know of something else. I mean, common sense tells you that is true, but it's also mathematically true under the free energy principle, in the sense that the only things you can read about the internal machinations of an agent are exposed on their Markov blanket or on their, more specifically, the states that act upon the world, because you are part of the world from the point of view of the agent. So you can only ever infer something is conscious, and that requires the observer. So what I'm doing is developing a very observational, relational position, just to acknowledge you will never know, which is going to be interesting in relation to machine consciousness. So that means that the observer has to have the fantasy, the hypothesis, the construct as part of their explanatory repertoire to make the inference that this thing, i.e., you, is conscious. So that puts a special, if you like, or it contextualizes, I think, discussions about consciousness. Only conscious artifacts can ever recognize consciousness in another. And that recognition is just another act of intelligence. It's just an act of inference. It's an explanation. This explanation that this thing is conscious in the sense that I am conscious is a good enough explanation to explain all the observable behavior. So there is no ground truth here. And I think that sort of takes up a lot of pressure off what could become quite toxic arguments in certainly machine consciousness and machine welfare. You cannot adopt a fundamentalist position on consciousness because by definition, you will never know. But it also means that these debates about machine consciousness or aspirations to build or discussions about could one build machine consciousness can only be had by people who subscribe to the notion that consciousness is a suitable fantasy or hypothesis to explain certain kinds of self-organization. I probably wanted a bit off point there, but I enjoyed making that point. But can you remind me what your question was?
It's so if we were to design a system that minimizes free energy and
Right.
generates affective states, is this a conscious
Yeah.
system?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so, from the point of view of what I've just said, um, um, yes and no. Yeah, it will, if it mimics consciousness to a suitably accurate extent, you will certainly infer it is conscious. And that's as far as anybody could go. Um, so, just to make this really concrete, I'm pretty sure that you're conscious. Pretty sure. I'm not absolutely, I can't be 100% sure, but I could certainly put a sort of base incredible interval around it, and and it would be all the evidence would be very, very strong with a base factor of say above 5.
Mm.
What about a microbe living in your gut? I'm not so sure. It might be some, in some sort of panpsychic or some very elemental sense. Um, but now my confidence in the inference that the microbe is conscious is sufficiently small that I have no qualms about poisoning it with antibiotics. Whereas I would have great qualms about poisoning you because you are sufficiently like me to provide enough evidence that you might be conscious, like I am. So I think I wouldn't decry mimicry. Mimicry is just reproducing the kind of evidence that satisfies a particular hypothesis. That is the basis of inference. So if you are sufficiently good mimic, then to all intents and purposes, under the condition that you can only infer something is conscious, yes, it would be conscious.
Mm. Mark, anything about that you'd like to add on?
Yes. I want to first of all reiterate what I said at the beginning. I'm looking forward to learning whether there's anything on this topic that Karl and I disagree about. And I mean that seriously. I would be very keen to know if there is anything we disagree about. So far not. But I'd come at things in a slightly different way from Karl. And so let me address the same question in my own way. And I will emphasize, or I will culminate my what I say it leads me to say something about mimicry, because I think that's the crux of your question. Because the way that you formulated your question before you used the word mimicry, I thought, well, it's a sort of, the question answers itself. When you say, if you have a free energy minimizing system functioning by active inference on the basis of its generative model, etc., and it also has affect, you said, then would it be conscious? And I thought, well, if it has affect, yes, of course it's conscious, because as I just said earlier, for me, the most basic form of consciousness is feeling, in other words, affect. I like the word feeling because it leaves one in no doubt that it's something that must be conscious. You can't have a feeling that you don't feel. So affect is a kind of functional term. Feeling is a descriptive term, if we're using the word affect and feeling synonymously, then such a system that has affect must be conscious. The problem, though, arises exactly with the issue that Karl just raised, which is, the inevitable issue that we have to address early on in a discussion of the kind that we're having today. It is, how would you ever know? How would you know from the functionality of a system whether or not it's conscious? Because consciousness, by definition, is something that can only be observed subjectively. If consciousness is a property of the being of a system, then only the system can register it in a direct empirical way. In other words, actually feel the feelings. And as Karl said, we can't be sure that each other are conscious. We can only be sure that each of us is, for that very reason. But now I'd like to pause for a moment and say, come on, let's not be silly. It's only philosophers say things like this. I can't be sure that Tevin Naidu is conscious, for heaven's sake. In reality, I don't doubt it for a moment. I can't know it as an absolute, empirically, demonstrably, observably true fact, but it's absurd to doubt it. And I would say it's absurd to doubt consciousness in certainly all mammals and certainly all vertebrates, because it is such a reasonable inference from my own experience and from what I know about the mechanistic basis of my own experience. What I know about the mechanistic basis of my own experience is that, because I believe all human beings, the three of us, are all conscious. What is it that makes us all human beings? Well, Karl says, well, we behave like each other, we look like each other, and so on. But scientifically, more to the point is the fact that we all have the same structures in our brains that we know empirically, in the case of humans, on the basis of all sorts of methods. We know that if you lesion that, it will produce a coma. If you stimulate that, it will produce an intense state of arousal with affective quality. These things have been demonstrated time and time again. Therefore, I start on the absolutely reasonable assumption that any other creature with the same anatomical infrastructure, that it's going to have the same functionality as me. Its behavior suggests it, just on ordinary naturalistic behavior. But more interestingly, I can make predictions, and I can say, because I know that stimulation of this in human beings produces intensely negative affective experiences, I predict that if I stimulate this in that creature, it's going to avoid the stimulus. And conversely, with those that produce intensely, the prediction is confirmed is upheld every time. So the answer, the scientific answer, by the ordinary scientific method, in other words, falsifiable predictions, it's confirmed every time. The problem starts for me. Let me pause. Sorry, I'm probably over-elaborating this, but this is such a fundamental thing, this problem of other minds issue to our whole discussion. Even that, what I've said so far, it's amazing how many people are skeptical. Neuroscientists are skeptical about consciousness in some other mammals. And consciousness in even more of them, in all vertebrates. They're very dubious about it, many colleagues. When I have absolutely no hesitation, I have as little hesitation as I have about whether Tevin and Karl are conscious. I have as little hesitation as to whether a zebrafish is conscious. because it's got the same anatomy, the crucial anatomy is there, and when you intervene, the predictions that you expect, the behavioral outcomes that you expect are always confirmed. But even there's what I'm going to just call prejudice. It's anthropocentric prejudice, or primate-centric prejudice, or something like that. That's the nub of the matter, because as soon as you move beyond vertebrates, and there's some very good candidates for consciousness beyond vertebrates, like, for example, the octopus is the creature that is most commonly invoked in this context. But if you look at the literature, there's pretty good evidence that a lot of invertebrates might be conscious, but the prejudices are enormous. And from this point onwards, once we go beyond vertebrates, I think that the problem is not only prejudice; it's also that you lose the obvious grounds for testing predictions by homology, because they don't have homologous anatomy, or their anatomy it's much more questionable whether these are true homologs of the crucial structures in humans. And so you've got to start using other criteria. And so it ends up becoming functional criteria. And how are we going to agree on what are the functional criteria by which to measure this question or to decide this question? Because the functional criteria vary depending on your particular mechanistic understanding of how consciousness works, what consciousness is. So the best we can do there is we have to, in advance, and when I say the best we can do, I mean if we're going to follow ordinary scientific method, the best we can do is agree a reasonable number of experts would have to agree in advance on a reasonable set of criteria by which they would say, if you meet X number, or if your system meets X number of these criteria, then we're going to have to give it the benefit of the doubt. And it has to be done in advance, because that's as close as you can come to what I was saying about the paradigm of falsifiable predictions. These are no longer predictions from anatomical homology, but rather predictions from reasonable functionalist and what behaviors you would expect on the basis of reasonable functionalist assumptions. So I think that's the best we can do. But to come now finally to the question of mimicry, I think that there are two things that I want to say. The one is, maybe they're the same thing. The one is that, forgive me for invoking authority, but even as pertinent an authority in this context as Tom Nagel says, an affective zombie is an impossibility. That any system that has the functional mechanisms that generate affect, because, as I said, for me, affect and feeling are the same thing. Happily, Nagel agrees. That if you have the functional mechanisms that generate feeling, then you can't have those without feeling. So it's just like it's a self-contradictory argument. I know where Chalmers is coming from when he talks about zombies, but affective zombies, I think it's not quite the same thing. You can't say that a thing that has that functional architecture and displays all the behaviors that go with affect, you can't say that it's a zombie, because affect is perforce felt. That's the function we're talking about here, is the function that generates feeling. If you have that function, it has to come along with feeling. And so to make my second point, which, as I say, may be the same point, I don't see how you can mimic if you have. It's a question. If you instantiate that architecture, that it's reasonable to believe is the mechanistic basis for whereby feelings are generated, then having such a mechanism is not mimicking what we have. It is instantiating what we have. And so, I would, and it all boils down again to what we said at the very beginning, that conscious states are felt. And so, if you're generating an affect, you're generating something, the measure of which is from the viewpoint of the system, that mechanism feels like something. I hope I'm making myself clear.
Karl, anything about that you'd like to respond to or add on?
Yes. Just to pick up and reinforce or reiterate a couple of key points. So the first is this acknowledgement that we are using homology as the basis of the evidence that we assimilate when making a decision about whether you or some artifact is conscious. Mark articulated that in terms of the scientific process. He deferred to Popper. Not everybody would, but he did, and that's perfectly fine. And that's exactly what I meant. But the consciousness is something you infer about something. It's an act of measurement. It's an observation that entails a degree of inference. And of course, that means there has to be evidence for that inference. And I think this is going to be practically relevant when we come to machine consciousness, because you're going to, people like Joshua Back are asking, what kind of evidence-based approaches should we take to this artifact to say whether it is conscious or not? So this is a really important question. I think Mark has very elegantly just sort of framed that as the key issue, and he, I repeat, articulated it in terms of Popperian scientific inference or hypothesis testing, and that's exactly what I meant in terms of inferring something is conscious. And then what he went on to say was, well, okay, we can certainly use structural anatomical homology as one source of evidence. So if I were able to breach your Markov blanket and look inside, say unfortunately you had died and I was able to dissect you, and I can look at the structure of your brain, and I can certainly find those sources of ascending classical neuromodulatory systems, around the base of your brain that are that machinery, that part of your anatomy that is necessary to support feeling. And I could infer, even though you are no longer conscious because you're dead, because I've broken your Markov blanket by literally slicing into your brain, then I could infer that you were conscious simply on that structural homology. Could I apply that to a zebrafish? Well, to a certain extent we can, because we can actually image the neuronal circuitry at least and look at the common homologies. And you may argue from the point of origin of life, there are lots of different structural, chemical homologies that one might appeal to as sources of evidence to make an inference, a best guess, is this thing conscious or not? And of course, what you're saying is, if it's sufficiently like me, it's conscious. And the more that homology is broken, and the further you wander away from zebrafish down to viruses, the less you can rely upon that homology. And then what Mark said, okay, well, are there other criteria? Because if I dissect my personal computer, I am not going to find these things. It just doesn't have the right anatomy, it doesn't have the right architecture, which may tell you that my PC will never be conscious. But let's just pursue the argument. But there may be some other homology there, which was a functional one. And I think that's, is that true? Can you ever have a divorce between the anatomy and the function? Can you have a divorce between the structure and the function, the dynamics on the structure? I would actually argue you can't. So I don't think this is a disagreement, but it's a particularly strong position, which I'm not necessarily committed to. But I would certainly argue, say, if I was Ross Ashby, or indeed Karl Friston, as the author of the free energy principle, I would argue that the anatomy is the substrate that embodies or entails the function. So this is the good regulator theorem. It's also appears again and again in the context of the free energy principle, that we install the cause-effect structure of our lived world into our anatomy, so that it has a hierarchy, so that reflects, for example, the scale invariance and the hierarchical composition of things that generate our sensorium. It has a separation of temporal scales. It has dynamics. It has, and so on and so forth. And there are lots of, if you like, aspects of the anatomy that are tie you down to a particular physiology, that tie you down to a particular functionality. And in many respects, most of the theories that attend the free energy principle are about that. So is my brain a predictive coding machine? Does it work like a Kalman filter? Or is it a belief propagation machine? Does it work like message passing on a factograph? Both are quite plausible hypotheses that specify a particular anatomy, a particular connectivity, a particular structure. So from that point of view, what we are saying then is, if we are looking at homologies, and both the functional and the anatomy, both are basically two sides of the same coin, then the inference that something is conscious is only by homology, which just means that you can only be conscious if you're sufficiently like me, which means you will not be able to recognize consciousness in any other kind of artifact or any other space-time scale. And I think that's important from a machine consciousness point of view, because you cannot now make consciousness in a machine that does not look like me. So now what you're saying is you have to turn to mortal computation, substrate-dependent computation, before you can build an artifact that's going to pass the Turing test of consciousness, because it has to have that homology. It has to have the same anatomy, the same computational anatomy, the same functional anatomy, the functional architecture as me, because that's the only source of evidence. Why is it the only source of evidence? Because it's only me that has feelings. So yeah, if this thing has feelings, it has to be like me. And I think that's important, to say out loud when it comes to questions about consciousness. That tells you two things: that machine consciousness is only going to be emergent when it's evinced in transaction with other things that are conscious, namely people. And it's going to have some mortal aspect to it, and possibly anthropomorphic structural aspect to it as well. But certainly the transactional aspect, the relational, the observational aspect is quite important. So you're not going to find consciousness on the edge. You're not going to find it in supercomputers. You're not going to find it, you could even argue, on von Neumann architectures, simply for just extending and formalizing the truisms that Mark was just articulating, which all rest upon homology. Is this thing like me?
So I want to come in there. First of all, I want to say something about Popper. It's not an endorsement of Popper that I invoke him here. The reason I do is because of the conservative, dispositions of the scientists who are going to be most skeptical, as I've encountered, even when it comes to trying to persuade some of my colleagues about vertebrate consciousness being ubiquitous. So I'm saying, well, let's use the most conservative rules and laws, principles, customs, that we use in science. Just about every natural scientist, functions by those Popperian sort of criteria, in terms of what your peers are going to expect you to do if they're going to accept the results that you want to publish. So I have nothing against Popper particularly, but I don't want to be seen to be endorsing Popper as the one and only voice that we should be guided by in the philosophy of science. It's just that he does have such hegemonic control over contemporary science. And so I'm saying, well, if we're going to follow those rules, then we must follow them fairly. We must say, okay, well, then let's apply them, beyond. It's a way of trying to get around prejudice, basically, in a word. But now back to the more substantive issues that Karl has just articulated. I think, and the reason I'm going to say what I'm going to say is that there's a lot of potential slippage in the way that what Karl has just said will be heard. So people with certain positions will say, you see, Karl Friston agrees with me, and people with a completely different position will say, you see, Karl Friston agrees with me. So because they will hear what he's saying in their own ways. So I want to just go slowly here. At the one extreme, Karl will have been heard now to have articulated a kind of biological naturalist position, saying that unless you have the same anatomy as me, or at least the same essential, your anatomy has a recognizably homologous structure, then I don't think it's possible that it can have the same functionality. Some people will hear what he said as that, as a biological naturalist. The substrate, this business is not substrate independent. Others, like me, will hear him as saying by anatomy, he means architecture, and he in fact used the word, in that way to my ear. He was saying an anatomy in the sense of it's not just a functionalism in terms of it's what it does. It doesn't matter on what substrate it does it. So if the outcome is the same, then it is the same. I don't think that if the outcome is the same in regard to a good many functions, and I want us to speak here in broad terms, because I don't want there to be exceptionalism when it comes to consciousness. That's another one of the prejudices that I'm trying to prevent it as far as is possible. Consciousness is just part of nature. It's something that must have mechanistic causes, like everything else. And it must be possible for us to eventually discern what that mechanism is. And therefore, it must be possible to be able to create that mechanism. If it's not, then consciousness is something utterly special, completely different from the whole of the rest of nature. So I'm saying when we speak about outcomes, not to do with consciousness, but outcomes, you could say, well, because you can travel to the same destination by aeroplane or by ox cart, therefore ox carts and aeroplanes are the same thing. And that's ridiculous. They're not. They're completely different things. They have the same outcome of getting you to Paris, but the one takes you 10 years to get there and the other, 10 hours, because they're completely different things. It's not just a matter of the destination. If the coming to biology, there are prostheses which have the same functional architecture, which are doing the same thing, not in the sense that I was just speaking now in terms of what the output is. It is what they're actually doing. When you're having open heart surgery, there's an artificial machine that keeps your blood circulating, but it's a completely different substrate. It's not made of muscle. It's a machine in the colloquial sense of the word. As opposed to a biological substrate, it's a mechanical artificial substrate, but it does do the same thing. So I think that we're looking at what Karl's talking about is a functional architecture. So it's not just the functional output, it's the functional architecture. I think that's what he's saying. That has to be homologous. It can't just be, it has the same behavioral output. It has to be doing the same thing. But that doesn't mean it has to be a biological creature. And I found it, I don't know, Karl, are you a commentator on Anil's paper in BBS? Yeah, so our close colleague, I mean, our close in every sense of the word, but most importantly for present purposes, he shares the same theoretical assumptions for the most part as Karl and I do. And yet he's recently, well, this paper hasn't come out yet, but it's doing the rounds because it's now in the process of open peer review. So I think it's okay to comment on it. He argues for a biological naturalist position when it comes to consciousness. I was rather surprised, but that's what he did. He explicitly argues a biological naturalist position, but then when you actually drill down into the article, he ends up saying, because it has to have this functional architecture. It has to be actually trying to maintain the life of the system. Consciousness is, and I agree with them. In terms of consciousness, its most basic form, which is just feeling. It's got everything to do with homeostasis. It's got everything to do. So therefore, with the free energy principle and active inference and all of that, but in the service of homeostasis and in the service of things which are fundamentally biological, the organism giving a damn, to quote Haugeland's famous computers don't give a damn. If the thing doesn't give a damn, then it about its own existence, and if it isn't seeking to maintain its own existence and deploying affect in the service of this subjective goal, etc., this existential goal, then says Anil, I don't see how it can be conscious. But then he goes on to say, but I grant you that there could be a robot which has non-carbon based instantiation of this same functionality, and he says then it would have artificial consciousness, real artificial consciousness, he calls it. So this is the slippage that I'm talking about. It sounds like biological naturalism, and Neil actually claims to be a biological naturalist, but he ends up saying something which is functionalist in the sense of functional architecture, doing something for the system of this kind. It doesn't have to be, and Anil basically concedes the point. It doesn't have to be made of neurons and muscle and vessel and so on. So maybe we are beginning to enter into an area of disagreement. I don't think so. I'm more worried about how Karl might be misheard if I've interpreted him correctly. I don't think, Karl, you're a biological naturalist.
Good, thank you. No, you're absolutely right. It's interesting you pick up on the sort of the architecture, and I've certainly, in the past decade, 3 decades ago, when we were doing a lot of brain scanning, the inception of positron emission tomography and subsequently fMRI, we're in a position for the first time to image the anatomy of the brain in function, and we use the term functional anatomy as distinct from structural anatomy, or the kind of anatomy that anatomists did. So for decades, I've used the word functional anatomy, but I've now deliberately changed it because that's too what did you call it? Biological, whatever. It's too constrained. What people are talking about are functional architectures. That's what I meant by dynamics on structure. So you're absolutely right, and it doesn't have to be carbon based, and it certainly doesn't have to be. For example, and I think this is sort of practically important because you will find a community out there who are committed to a particular kind of neuromorphic way forward in terms of artificial consciousness based upon spiking neural networks, SNNs. So that is really going a particular commitment to a biomimetic neuromorphic kind of computation where they're actually emulating the spike by spike physiology of synaptic transmission. I don't think that is what is implied by certainly the self-evidence implied by things like the free energy principle. What is implied is the anatomy of the cause-effect structure being installed in the message passing on the dynamics in your computer, whether your computer is your brain or your personal computer. That it is that architecture that absolutely I was talking about, and doesn't need to be cast at the scale of spikes. It could be population dynamics, and indeed, you could argue as a physicist, all physics, including the physics of sentience and the physics of consciousness, is just a statement of probabilistic dynamics. So you don't need to actually simulate every element of an ensemble over which you have a probability distribution. You just need to simulate the functional architectures that describe the density dynamics, the probability density dynamics. And I put it like that because you can always reduce any functional architecture to a graphical model. And it's just the connectivity and the architecture of that graphical model that I was implying when when I talked about sort of functional anatomy. One final point, just again to sort of reiterate Mark's point. The, the, well, perhaps we'll come back to this, but I was trying to sort of pick up on Anil's arguments and amplify them in a way that I thought he would be pleased with. And I didn't spot the biological aspect too much, but what I did spot was the commitment to in-memory processing and mortal computation. So I'm not saying the substrate has to be carbon-based. What I'm saying is that the stuff in and of itself has to do the computation. And that becomes very relevant when we're talking about von Neumann architectures and in-memory processing, such as, say, with memristors or photonics. So I'm going to put that on the side. I think that's something we might have to come back to, because when I talk about mortal computation and when people like Alex and Jeff Hinton talk about mortal computation, we're not talking about biological neuronal networks. We are talking about the functional architectures that render the substrate locally doing the computation. And it could be, I repeat, say memristors. But there's another take, which is Alex's take on mortal computation, which resonates beautifully with what Mark was just saying. That Okay, what is mortal computation? You could say it is intelligence. And if you've got affect or feeling under the hood during the mortal computation, then you have consciousness. What will be immortal computation? Well, anything that can be run by software that is immortal. So software that can be run on any machine is immortal. But if the software is the thing that is conscious, then it has no need to worry about persisting, surviving, responding to drives or needs because it's immortal. So Alex makes this really interesting point that the existential imperatives that underwrite self-organization of the kind that induce the notion of drives and needs and affects and feelings can only be an attribute of something that can die. Because its whole purpose is to prolong the period between its introduction into the world and the point that it departs. So it has to be mortal in this sort of commonsensical sense.
Guys, I'm going to let us come back to that. I made a note about it just so that we don't accidentally forget to answer the question. Karl, perhaps let's continue with you for now. Is it possible? With that being said, I tried to preface this with a philosophical conversation first about consciousness. And there's something else I'd like to touch on that still hasn't been asked. But let's start with the main topic at hand. Is it possible then to engineer artificial consciousness?
Yeah, I see no reason why not. You just need to identify the right functional anatomy. And as you say, it is going beyond creating agents, but I think you'd have to have agency as part of your intelligent artifact. And then you would need to equip it with affect and the machinery necessary to support feelings. How would you do that? Well, we've just touched on sort of three issues. First of all, you would, I think, have to commit to mortal computation. I don't think you can do this on a von Neumann architecture, and we can talk about why in a second. We could certainly simulate consciousness in a sort of layman's sense on a Newman architecture, and this would be very much akin to Mark's example of a heart-lung machine keeping a patient alive during heart surgery. So it's perfectly possible to simulate the kind of belief updating and message passing and potentially simulate the affect read in this instance as investing certain messages or certain belief structures with a confidence or a precision or igniting them in the right kind of way so that they make a difference to your intelligent processing. But if it's on a von Neumann architecture, it would be mimicry in a sort of vernacular sense, in the same way that the heart-lung machine is mimicking the functionality of the biological heart and pulmonary system, which is, of course, the real thing can do forever. The heart-lung machine is going to run out of electricity at some point or break. It's just not fit for purpose for an extended period of time, unlike the mortal computation or the mortal circulation that we enjoy with our actual heart and lungs. So I think it's going to have to be mortal, which basically means I think you're looking at I would imagine memristas or possibly photonics, but I think more likely to be memristas architectures. And then the other thing we talked about is this relational thing that this artifact has to learn to be like you or to be like things that feel in order to have as part of its generative model the notion of affect or feeling, or at least be able to report that. Mark would probably argue not. He would argue that you just need to equip it with the right neuromodulators so that it can realize its inferences. And what would they look like? Well, they look a little bit like attention head and transformer architectures, but with one key difference. These attention heads have to be selected by some other aspect of the generative model. So it's like having, if you like, a context-sensitive, learnable attention head. And I think if that was implemented on a using in-memory processing or processing in memory computer architectures with the right kind of reactive message passing or actor model of as Keith Duggar likes to talk about. I think you're getting very close to it, and it would have to be done. It would have to be done in an interactional way. You'd have to, you can't just set it off and use reinforcement learning, come back, make yourself conscious, and let me know when you've done it. It would have to be an ongoing process of interaction within an ecosystem where there was some shared generative model. And I forgot to say earlier on, again, this notion of homology is absolutely central, I think, because when I talk about these things, consciousness depends upon a shared narrative, a shared generative model. And certainly talking about it does, because communication language does. So another aspect of homology is the fact that we all come to share the same functional architectures because we all learn the same things, we learn the same language. And of course, that's a fundamental aspect of minimizing uncertainty and minimizing free energy when we all come to predict each other. And from that emerges language and communication. And of course, the notion, the hypothesis that we all have feelings and we can talk about the feelings. Not necessary to have the feelings, but we can certainly talk about them. So if you want to have that as part of your machine consciousness, that means you're going to have to evolve it very much in the way that we grow, we bring up our children. It's going to have to be a transactional process. You're not going to be able to write down with an RL algorithm, or use a large language model, go and make me a conscious artifact. It's going to require a lot of interaction, possibly dyadic or possibly federated, in a sort of ecosystem that includes things that can feel, or we think feel.
Mark, same question. Is it possible to engineer artificial consciousness? And thereafter, you can also address all the points that Karl made.
Yeah. I mean, this is the question that our meeting is designed to address. So, I'm glad we're being asked to answer it with half an hour to go, so we still can talk about mopping up the details, but we must here each commit to an answer, a position on this question. Before I give you my answer, which I don't think is going to come as a big surprise, I just want to pick up on one detail in what Karl said, because, as I keep saying, I'm not sure there's anything we'll disagree about. So my comment on his previous response was, I'm worrying some people might think we disagree. So I clarified that, and I'm glad we don't disagree about substrate independence, as opposed to functional architectural homology that we agree about, and that's the nub of the matter. And it turned out to be the nub of the matter in Anil's article too. The point that Karl said Mark might disagree, I want to pick up on that point, again, in the spirit of wanting to clarify where do we disagree if we do. It was on the question of reportability. And so I want to say something about that, which might seem sort of peripheral or even gratuitous, but it turns out to be quite important. Many of my colleagues working in this field of consciousness, neuroscience of consciousness, they hold reportability to be the empirical gold standard. They're saying, if you, and they're speaking because they're anthropocentric, they have in mind humans, and they're saying, look, if the person, like, for example, when you reducing the speed of the stimulus in a tachistoscopic setup or something like that, there has to be a certain point where the person says, I no longer see it. Or there has to be a certain point at which they say, now I see it. And, that is the empirical criterion. It's because we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about experience, and you have to report, I am experiencing it or I'm not. And they, this was thrown at me, for example, recently, when I speak of hydranencephalic children who've got no cortex, they say, well, there's no empirical evidence that they're conscious because they can't report. And I say, yeah, well, my Labrador can't report. My children couldn't report before they learned to speak. Are you really seriously, claiming that my Labrador is not conscious because it can't report? And the argument I make there is reportability it's the easiest thing in the world to get something to report that it's conscious when it's not. So I don't disagree with Karl about reportability in the sense that, I would like my agent to be able to report that it's conscious, but it's very easy to mislead. It's very easy to get a entirely non-conscious agent to say, like a large language model, it can say, I'm feeling such and such, but there's no reason whatsoever to believe that it is. So we've got to get beyond reportability. And this brings us back to, what do we really mean by what is a conscious state? And it comes back again to this question of mimicry. If we accept, and not everybody accepts it, but if we accept for the sake of argument, my claim that raw feeling is the elemental form of consciousness. All you have to have is feeling. To be able to report it is great, but you don't have to be able to report it. You just have to be able to feel it. To me, that cannot be mimicked, except in the sense of misleading us. So that's why I'm saying reportability is a very misleading criterion, because it's so easy to create an artificial intelligence that's going to report all sorts, which is mimicry in the sense of misleading us. But you can't mimic a feeling because its presence or absence is a subjective presence or absence. So if there's a feeling there, it can't be mimicked. It is felt. Whether it's an artificial feeling or a biological feeling is a different matter. But to me, the thing that we're talking about when we speak of consciousness, to me, fundamentally, we're talking about feeling, and a feeling, when it's there, will be felt, and therefore it's not something. It's not a behavioral thing. It's a state of the system. So now to your question, the big question, which, as I said, my answer is not surprising. Absolutely, I believe that it is possible to engineer an artificial consciousness. I see no reason whatsoever why we can't do it. And it's because of what I said earlier, so I won't repeat it in detail. I'll just give you the headline again. It's part of nature. It's not exempt from if something's part of nature. To quote Feynman, that statement that he wrote on his blackboard, which was found upon his death. If I can't create it, I don't understand it, was what he wrote. And so, if you understand how consciousness, in the sense that I'm using it, how feeling arises, then you should be able to create it. I believe if we, to the extent that we do understand how feeling arises, we can create it now already. But I'm not so sure that we have a complete understanding of how feeling arises, but I think we're in the right sort of ballpark. If we're in the utterly wrong ballpark, somebody else will understand how feelings arise and they will create it artificially. So I'm unequivocal that it's possible and it will happen. It's just a matter of when and how. Let me add then some detail in terms of what do I think causes feeling. And I'll try to be brief. Obviously, because of time constraints, I'm not going to do full justice to the whole thing. But I think that a Markov blanketed self-organizing system, from the point of view of first of all, such a system does have a point of view, which is an important starting point, an important prerequisite for selfhood. It has to have a point of view. There's the point of view of the system upon what is not the system. That from the point of view of such a system, and please note what I've described is not something complicated. This is something easily engineered, an artificial self-organizing system with a Markov blanket, which has a point of view, and from its point of view, increasing free energy just is bad. It just is, So and it's important to emphasize it's only bad from the point of view of the system. So there we have subjectivity, a mechanistic basis for describing what we mean by, and I don't mean felt subjectivity. I'm saying there is a point of view of such a system, and it's registering something, some mechanistic property is being registered within a value system, which, from the point of view of the system, increasing free energy is bad for the system. So there we have valence, mechanistically described, goodness and badness, subjectively construed in entirely mechanistic terms. Then what you need to add to that is that's a continuous variable, free energy going up and down. The valence is not it's a value, but I think you need to add something more, which is that that complex systems of the kind I have in mind have multiple. They have multiple needs, multiple survival needs. I mean, there are multiple categories of things that have to be kept within their viable bounds for the system to persist. By the way, I should have emphasized that at the beginning. I completely agree with Karl that such a system has to be artificially alive. It's artificially alive. That it's what I'm describing is a system that is seeking only to continue to exist as a system. That's what I've just described. It mechanistically is such a system. But if it has multiple categories of need, multiple categories of viable bounds, then those must be treated as categorical variables by the system. They must. Mechanistically, they must. You can't add 8 out of 10 of thirst to 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and say that's 16 out of 20 of total need, therefore all I need to do is sleep. If you don't also drink, you will die. So these needs have to be treated as categorical variables, which means, and here's the crucial point, that they necessarily are qualitatively differentiated. That's what we mean by a categorical variable. That when I say that 8 out of 10 of sleepiness is not the same thing as 8 out of 10 of thirst, they are qualitatively different. And so there, I think we have a mechanistic account of the ground zero of qualia, that from the point of view of such a system, it's got a point of view, it has a subjective goodness or badness, which must be qualitatively differentiated. And all of this is registered only internally by the system, for the system. I think that's the kind of basic functional, very basic. Remember, I'm not going into details, but for me, that's the basic functional architecture of a system that has an elementary form of feeling. There's a lot more detail, but that's my. So when I say if we're in the right ballpark, that's the ballpark I'm in.
Mark, anything about that you'd like to comment on? And just to try and play devil's advocate, to try and see if there's anything you guys do disagree with. How much importance do you place, Karl, so on feeling and this version of feeling that Mark just defined and described, valence and qualia, in terms of consciousness, and then trying to engineer it?
I put a lot of emphasis on that for a particular reason, which I will conclude with, but just to take that key point that Mark just made from a technical perspective. If you remember before, I was glibly saying you can't just use a large language model to say, go and make me an intelligent artifact or use DeepRL. I had a reason for saying that. And the reason is exactly what Mark was describing in terms of multiple variables that provide constraints on the kind of thing that I am, or the states that are characteristic of the kind of thing that I am. And if I violate those states, then I will be very surprised. I will have a high free energy. So just keeping myself within those viable range of essential variables of any sort is just a definition of existing and living. And of course, if you're a physiologist, it's just a definition of homeostasis and possibly homeoresis and allostasis. If you're a statistician or at least a statistical physicist, what you're talking about is the maths of multiple constraint satisfaction. So I would read the multiple categories that Mark was talking about that cannot be collapsed into one dimension. He was talking about thirst and hunger, for example. These are two-dimensional structures. In fact, they're multidimensional structures. So you've got multiple constraints that have to be satisfied. And I use that phraseology because that is exactly what you get when you turn to the good and great of statistical physics, for example, E.T. Jaynes. So he describes physics, certainly its meteorological measurement aspect of physics, just as maximum entropy under constraints. And it's the constraints that shape the kind of thing you are. And violating those constraints just is increasing free energy. So from a physicist's perspective, Mark's emphasis on multiple ways of being surprised, multiple ways of dying, multiple ways of being out of kilter in a homeostatic or emotional or social or whatever sense. This is what basically provides the shape of you and your self-organization. And complying with those constraints just is a constrained maximum entropy principle that just is the free energy principle. So on that level, I thought that was an important thing, which is why you can't do it with RL. You can't do it with reinforcement learning because you've only got one category to reinforce, either money or sweeties or likes. You can't do multiple constraint satisfaction properly with RL, but you can do it with your constrained maximum entropy principles or the free energy principle or active inference, provided you've got the right functional architecture in play that has all of these multiple constraints and dimensions. Everything that either can be observed or everything that is brought to the table to explain those observations, they all have to have a shape. Some of them will be very, very precise. I can only be plus or minus zero point 0.6 degrees centigrade away from this preferred temperature. Some can be very, very forgiving. Um, I can be me in the North Pole. I can be me in New York. I can be me in Cape Town. Some things have enormous, very precise constraints, and sometimes they have less precise, but they still have to be constrained. They define. So you need a calculus, you need an algorithm, you need a description, a mechanics of self-organization that allows for this. And I think that's a point which which I've just reiterated. In terms of Mark did say he was keeping it really simple. To my mind, I think he kept it a bit too simple. I think just making inferences under constraints. I think denies him the opportunity to wax lyrical about the encoding of uncertainty and the very essence of beliefs. We start off by saying that I can only believe you are conscious. I can never know. So we're talking about a calculus of belief structures, of probability densities, and of course the most important, well, the second most important aspect of a probability distribution or belief structure after its location or content is its shape. And for me, that would be most simply described in terms of its negentropy or its precision. So the encoding of uncertainty in working out how to sate your needs, to me, is the heart of feeling, as I read Mark. He didn't say that, so I'm going to pass it back to him to see if he wants to be slightly less simple. Just having an inference machine that complies with some prior preferences. I mean, it may be right, but I get the feeling that much of your thinking and and I know that, of course, Tevin does as well, but for those people who don't know, Mark actually has a group of bright young things actually trying to build artificial consciousness at the moment, and he's taken it a little bit further than his straightforward explanation would suggest.
Yes, thank you, Karl. I really want, I mean, my eye on the clock, and so I wanted to keep it absolutely simple. And the thing that I was emphasizing is, in very broad brushstrokes, what do we mean by a mortal system, and why does what kind of mortal system, where does the possibility or the necessity of feeling fit into it? And so I was saying the necessity of feeling fits into it in the sense that its values in terms of trying to remain in existence. In other words, its monitoring of its free energy has to be distributed across multiple categories, which means they must be qualitatively registered by the system. But that, what I said, is certainly not sufficient so let's start with what Karl ended with when he spoke about a prior preference distribution. He said, it's not enough just to for such a system just to be maintaining its prior preference distribution. So I'll add here a little bit of detail. And before I do that, I want to say, picking up on what Karl has just said, that I am leading a team together with my colleague Jonathan Schock, a brilliant young physicist, which is trying to do this. We're trying to instantiate the sorts of functional architectures that we're talking about. And so I know from experience how difficult it is when it gets down to the detail. I mean, it's extremely, we've been at it for a few years and we're dealing with minute, complex things all the time. So, even what I'm going to say now is still very broad brushstrokey compared to the level of granular problem that you end up having to grapple with. So picking up on this prior preference distribution, there is this essential next point is it's a matter of prioritizing which of those categories at any one point in time is going to be subject to it requires voluntary behavior. In other words, the capacity to change your mind, to choose one path of action as opposed to another. You can't do that with all those categories simultaneously. You can't do everything at once. There's an action bottleneck and an attentional bottleneck, and they boil down to being very similar things, which is extremely interesting. So it's a matter of I have a need which is heading into non-viable territory, and I now need to institute a policy as to how to satisfy this need. In other words, how to return to my preferred state, which is not just a preference in this. It's an existential requirement. So I've got to return to my preferred state, and so I act in accordance with my policy. And this is what voluntary action boils down to. I am able to register how well or badly is this going before it's too late. That's the crux of why we feel. So those values I was talking about don't only the value of it's good to survive and bad to die, don't only work on the level of natural selection over generations. But for me now, as a mortal system, how do I know before it's too late whether the policy that I'm following is succeeding or not? And so it's feeling my way through the problem and changing my behavior accordingly. That is the mechanistic basis of that is what Karl was just talking about. It is palpating my confidence in the policy. And that's got to do with precision. So it's modulating my confidence, modulating the precision in this policy versus alternative policies. In other words, this policy or some future policy, changing your mind, the system changing its mind. I don't hesitate to use that phrase as it's going along. And while it's doing that in the prioritized category of need, the other needs are being they can't be disregarded, but they are being relegated to automaticity. So they're fixed precisions. The policies, I'm running those policies on that one, but and it doesn't have to be one prioritized need. It can be two conflicting needs. But the point is that there's an attentional spotlight in terms of what is going to be subject to voluntary action. In other words, to the palpating of my precision in my action policies as I go along. And all of that is tethered to feeling. In the sense of this is going well or badly in terms of this particular category, this particular quality. Meanwhile, everything else, is relegated to automaticity for this action cycle. But then, what is to be prioritized next? In each sort of artificially divided action cycle, the focus may now shift to another need. Or on the basis of another opportunity, and that too is all regulated on the basis of precision. So it's a matter of precisions in the needs, and then precisions in the policies that we're following to meet those needs. All of that has to do with the modulation of precision. And coming back to functional architectures and to actual anatomical architectures. This is what happens in the brain, at least of vertebrates. That's the part of the system that's modulating this precision in all of the sensory-motor message passing is the reticular activating system, or these arousal structures, which are modulating postsynaptic gain. So the functionality that we've just described is the functionality of those anatomical systems in the vertebrate brain. So this is the kind of thing that gives me confidence we're on the right track. You're muted, Tevin.
Thanks, Mark. Karl, anything you'd like to add to that? And also, while we're at it, Mark, at some point you can just tell us as well some of the problems you might be having or encountering because you're actively working on this. Maybe Carl has some answers to some of those problems.
Um, I just make a couple of just to pick up on something that was implicit but really important. So notice that Mark, when he's actually getting into the job of building machine consciousness, um, notice that everything was about policies, which means that we're talking about functional architectures that support agency. So that's quite important. You're not going to get consciousness from a large language model because the large language model doesn't do the prompting. It doesn't act upon the world. So you have to have a different kind of functional architecture to have policies, to have in mind the consequences of your actions, and indeed, to use Mark's word, to feel your way into the future and then select the most likely and adjust in the face of evidence that you secure by pursuing this policy or that policy. I thought it was just important to say that, there are certain architectures that are requisite if you ever want to walk towards a conscious artifact. And that notion of agency, I think it's just worthwhile noting that the very word to feel is a verb. So to feel is not a state of, I am not in a state of feeling. Mark used the word palpate. To feel is to palpate. So what we're talking about is again something that is quintessentially inactive and agentic. It's just agentic on the inside. It's just mental action, action on the inside. If you're a psychologist, it would be called attention. If you actually have to build, in the spirit of Feynman, a machine that has attention, hence my reference, possibly um, disingenuous reference to attention heads. But Mark is referring exactly now to the precision that could also that does the determines what things are selected for belief updating or committing to a particular policy in exactly the spirit that a psychologist would think about attentional selection. So that gating, that coordination, it's all action on the inside. It's all acting, and it's all about palpating the confidence, the uncertainty, and indeed, one of my favorite phrases from Mark is felt uncertainty underrides qualitative experience. But it's an active feeling. So again, we come back to this. And the final point is that if you actually try to simulate classical kinds of either economics games or reward learning games that evoke phasic dopamine responses and transfer from a condition to an unconditioned stimulus, what you see is that the brain's evaluation of the precision of the distribution of all the policies I could take seems to predict almost exactly dopaminergic discharge. And of course, that can go up or it can go down. So you've got valence for free simply because the average of the expected free energy just is this entropy or negentropy that Mark is talking about. Notice that there are lots of other probability distributions, the state of the world, beliefs in certain contingencies or likely mappings or transition dynamics, but specific beliefs about what I am going to do next, beliefs over policies or condition probability distributions over policies. They have an attribute of precision, and that seems to explain exactly dopamine, and it is the average expected free energy. Which can go up or down and has sort of valence for free. So I think there's a beautiful closure here. When you actually walk the path that Mark is walking, Mark is walking this path that I am not. So it's unlikely I'm going to have any answers for him, but I'd be very interested to hear the questions.
Yeah, Mark, what's been puzzling you guys the most, would you say?
That would take a very long time. There are many, many things. The thing that's exercising me the most, and I think we might have time for me to ask Karl a question in this direction. It has to do with what I mentioned earlier when I said I think we need to draw up in advance a list of functional and behavioral criteria whereby reasonably qualified stakeholders, can reach a reasonable amount of consensus about these sorts of tests if these boxes can be ticked, or sufficient number of them, then the weight of the evidence is in favor of inferring consciousness in such an agent. So we've been. I was at a conference of all places in Kathmandu a little while ago. It was called. The focus was not artificial consciousness, but non-human consciousness. So there were many animal consciousness experts there and artificial consciousness people. And we had a session in this conference. In fact, we broke up into little groups, and then we all came together to give our the outcomes of our discussions, where we were asked to agree what were the tests for consciousness that we found most convincing, bearing in mind that we're talking about tests which have to be applicable both to animals, non-human animals, and to artificial systems. And the test that won the vote as having the highest confidence of us experts assembled in this conference was something called the Hedonic Place-Preference test. So conditioned place-preference behavior is let's go back to those zebrafish I was talking about earlier. They tend to hang out where the food is delivered on this side of the tank. But if you then deliver on that side of the tank something which does not have nutritional value, but which does have hedonic value, like, since Karl's speaking about dopamine, like cocaine, for example, then if these fish have feelings, then you might get them to prefer to hang out there. You might predict they would prefer to hang out where the cocaine is, even though it has no nutritional value to them. Its only value is hedonic. In other words, it's felt, it's affective. So the hedonic place preference test is if the agent shows that sort of behavior, then that's weighty evidence for it having subjective feeling states. And I want to just point out, here's another thing that's really been exercising my team, that to engineer a system that displays this sort of behavior is not to engineer the most efficient system. It's to engineer a system which can make mistakes, which can do things which are not in its own best interest, but it thinks or feels that they are. So there you have a gap between the sort of hardwired, forgive the phrase, the kind of RL type of thing, and this feeling my way through the problem. And by the way, I have to add, what Karl said is 100% true. It's a verb. It's palpating your uncertainty. So one of the things that's exercising us at the moment is how do we engineer this kind of functionality? And it seems as if it's certainly it is doable. But it's I'd love to, before we close, to hear Karl's views about that, about both whether he thinks that is a compelling test for felt uncertainty and or for feelings, and whether he has any ideas about how one would go about instantiating this kind of distinction within an artificial agent.
We've run out of time, but I can't resist this noting. So your solution then is basically to ensure that we can make computers into drug addicts, and if we can do that effectively and simulate all the perverse pleasure or possibly suffering, that's a brilliant idea. I haven't thought about it. I thought you were going to say the Salian test or some sort of theory of mind or perspective taking, but making them into drug addicts is exactly the right thing to do. I should just say that both Mark and I are involved in a number of institutions and bodies who are really trying to drill down on this for the common good, including the Consortium organization and also the California Institute for Machine Consciousness are really desperately trying to understand these issues. So some of the things that Mark has said and I have said are resonating with and probably mimicking some of the discussions that are ongoing with a wide group of people. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as other sources of sort of or perspectives on this issue, and why it's such an important issue from many perspectives. How you instantiate it, I think, is quite simple. And I'm sure Mark has actually done this. It's just basically to make sure that you have, as part of your functional architecture, the ability to palpate or to feel your uncertainty. And that necessarily introduces a certain kind of hierarchical or parametric depth to your generative models. It is unremarkable from the point of view of a statistician, because the whole point of statistics is to estimate your felt uncertainty in the form of standard error. So people like Fisher and Box, the whole of parametric statistics was just invented to get a feel for or a handle on the uncertainty when making an inference. So yeah, the maths is there. It's just a question of putting that into a computer architecture. I think perhaps attention heads are baby steps in that direction, but that's not good enough. Just having the mechanism to exert the products of your felt uncertainty does not actually prescribe where the actions of actually estimating the standard error or the uncertainty. But in principle, we know how to do that as a statistician. All Mark has to do now is to build it into in the spirit of Feynman, make one, and then he'll understand it.
Well, gentlemen, this was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. It's truly an honor and privilege to have you both chatting together. And I hope you had a great time, and it was an absolutely great discussion.
Thank you for having us, Tevin, and thank you, Karl. It's always an enormous pleasure to interact with you, and I always learn something new. But this topic is the closest to my heart at the moment, and so it's really enjoyable to be able to engage with a mind like Karl's, and to have a host like you, Tevin. I want to underscore in closing one thing that Karl just said, which it was in what he said, but again, it needs emphasis. That we're working, both he and I, together with organizations who are concerned about the ethics of all of this. So we are not, or at least since it's me that's at that particular coalface, I want to reassure our audience that we're not going at this like cowboys, and we're not going at it alone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I also say thank you before you all go away? Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Until next time.
Yeah. Cheers, guys. Thank you so much. Have a great
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.